Well, hello and welcome to another episode of About Abortion. Today, I have the privilege of having Dr. Calum MacKellar here for an interview. He has written a recent book called Christianity and the New Eugenics. Now, Dr. Calum MacKellar is a researcher and he works for a bioethics charity in Edinburgh, and he's also a member of the United Free Church of Scotland. His most recent book, Christianity and the New Eugenics, Should We Choose to Have Only Healthy or Enhanced Children? I read because I saw a book review by Tim Dieppe from Christian Concern, and I read that review and I thought I just need to read this book. In the book, there's lots of ideas and things that are going on that I think Christians really need to be aware of, especially the thought process that is influencing a lot of people that they might not be aware of. So, Dr. Calum MacKellar, thank you for coming on to this interview. Welcome to the show. Now, I'm
Thank you.
excited for people
Thank
to
you.
hear some of these ideas that are in your book, what you have to say. But before we start talking about your book, would you maybe just introduce yourself and talk a bit about your history, how you became a doctor and how you got into this field of speaking about eugenics?
Well, my background is a bit complex, actually. I mean, I've always been interested in medical ethics, even as a wee boy, a small boy. So when I was 8 years old, my mother was a midwife, and sometimes she would talk about some of the issues that she faced at work, and I was fascinated by it. I don't know why; it's just like that. But when I went to university, you could not study biomedical ethics. You could not even study bioethics. There was nothing like that at university, even in America. You could study moral philosophy, but that's certainly something I did not want to study. So I ended up doing biochemistry. So I'm actually a research doctor. So I'm not a medic. So I'm a biomedical scientist. I ended up doing my doctorate in Germany. In those days, there was a lot of AIDS around. So my PhD was related to try and find some treatment for AIDS. I then went back to Edinburgh University to work with the Medical Research Council again to try and find genetic drugs against AIDS. And after my postdoc, I went into industry, continued to make new kinds of DNA and RNA. But slowly I became bored in a way. I was just, especially in industry, you just make money for your bosses, which is fair enough. I mean, that's what industry is all about, making money. But I wanted something more challenging, and so I remembered my interest in medical ethics. I've always been, as I said, I've always been interested in it. So I started doing bioethics. I started a journal, actually, an academic journal that's still going, called The New Bioethics. I ended up actually at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, so I was in the office for bioethics. I was one of the top civil servants there. So the Council of Europe is a lot bigger than the European Union. It goes from Vladivostok in Russia, at least in those days, because Russia has been kicked out of the Council of Europe, all the way to Greenland. So I was responsible for quite a number of topics, including end of life, xenotransplantation, that's putting pigs' hearts into humans, and so on. And then more than 21 years ago, I was offered this job in Scotland to do something very similar to what I was doing in the Council of Europe. But instead of doing it for 800 million people, I was just now doing it for 5 million people. So I've been working now as a director of research for the Scottish for a charity in Scotland for the last 21 years. So that's how I've been. That's how I got into bioethics. There's not many of us who are scientists in bioethics around the world. I'm not the only one, though. I know a few others. But most people who go into bioethics are either lawyers, medical doctors. In France, it's mainly philosophers. Germany, you get quite a few theologians as well. But in Scotland, well, in scientists, so there's a number of us, but we're not many.
Well, thank you. It sounds like quite an interesting mix of interdisciplinary subjects that I think would be quite fascinating, actually, to be able to contribute together in order to talk about some of these issues. So, really interesting. Before we talk more about the book as well, can you explain to our listeners what is eugenics and why you wrote a book about eugenics?
So eugenics is actually a Greek word. For the beginning part of eugenics. Eu means good. Genetics means bringing into life. So in Greek, eugenics means the good bringing into life. Now, eugenics has been around for a long, long time, and even Plato, one of the Greek philosophers, more than 2,000 years ago, had eugenic ideas, and he was wanting to encourage people to only have the best kind of children. But it really took off after Charles Darwin wrote his book
Mm.
on evolution, and actually a cousin of Charles Darwin, Sir Francis Galton, was quite fascinated by this theory of evolution, but also fascinated by the way animals were bred, like cows, sheep, dogs, even. And so Francis Galton said, well, why are we selecting uh, these animals? And we don't have a problem with it. I mean, now cows produce a lot more milk than they used to. But why are we not doing this with human beings? So right at the end of the 19th century, so Francis Galton basically started writing about eugenics, and he coined the term eugenics. Um, so it's really it came back in a way as a big discussion in society at the very end of the 19th century. So eugenics really took off. But then I'll probably say a few words about this later on. But after the Second World War and after the atrocities of the Second World War, it all became taboo. And for many years, nobody would even mention the word, even or even do any kind of have any kind of proposals in this direction. But it is coming back, and that's why I wrote the book. I was actually headhunted by IVP to write this book. I hesitated a long time because I had a lot of work to do, and writing books takes a long time.
Mm.
Uh, but then I was very concerned that Christians were not talking about this topic, that churches were not talking about this topic. So I decided to agree to write this book. So that's why the book was written, to try and inform, especially the churches, about the dangers of eugenics.
I think a lot of people hear the word eugenics and they do think kind of end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. They kind of think, well, that was then. That's in the past. They maybe have heard of the G.K. Chesterton book, Eugenics and Other Evils, but considering it as a current practice may not be in people's kind of sphere of thinking. And so I agree. I think this is actually something that really needs to be opened up and discussed, particularly by Christians. Now, it's interesting that you said it kind of almost had a revival coming out of Darwin's book of and theory of evolution. And so do you really think that that's where this is coming from, a sort of social Darwinianism, that it's taking the practice of evolution and survival of the fittest into our own hands and applying it ourselves? Do you think that's really the root, or do you think that the root of the issue is something else?
I think the root of the issue is control. Human beings love controlling. Yeah. And eugenics, I mean, the way we define eugenics is all about the, trying to improve strategy, trying to encourage strategies of selection of the children, selection of communities, inside communities, or selection in humanities. So eugenics is closely associated each time to selection. Um, and so far, children have been born as they have been born. We have had no control over them. But because we can now select and we can have control. Uh, the slogan for Brexit was "Let's take back control." Yeah, and that was really something that was uh, seen as positive by a lot of
Mm.
people. Control is positive, especially in our modern society. And so that's, I think, one of the main reasons why this eugenic selection is coming back. I think another reason is probably people, well, for some people at least, they want to. So perfection reflects, in a way, God, um, especially perfection in human beings. It's interesting that, I was just thinking about this a few weeks ago, that the number of gyms in Edinburgh is incredible. There's a multiplication of gyms, so everybody wants to have the perfect body. Apparently, I don't think they only go to stay fit, because it's usually young people and so on that are in these gyms. What are they looking for? In a way, they're looking for perfection. Well, at least as perfect as possible. Yeah,
Mm.
and perfection always reflects God. And I think I think there's something in there. I think we are looking for perfect persons, and actually, the only really perfect person is God. Um, so we are looking for something. But I don't think
Mm.
we are conscious that we are looking for something, and I'm not sure we're conscious of who we're looking for. I'm convinced we are looking for God, but it's not by making perfect human beings that we will become like God or find God. Um, but I think there's something there. I think it needs to be unpacked somehow.
Yeah, well, that's a really insightful comment. The control, kind of taking the sovereignty for ourselves, and then, like you said, becoming like God, in terms of creating perfect people. It's really got that roots in Genesis, doesn't it? Where Eve is convinced to become like God, to take the fruit, to become like God, and really that's the source of all of our evils, isn't it? That we are trying to become like God. Now,
We're trying. Yeah, I think uh, uh, creating children is something that is fascinating. You know, 9 months before there is nothing, and then 9 months later you have a child. It's magic in a way, and it's fascinating, and it's something that human beings want to mimic. I would say they want to do this. So human beings, they can create these children, but and I don't have any children, but I find when I look at my friends who have children, I always find it fascinating how bringing into life is magic. But I think human beings believe that they can improve the whole process. So
mm,
far, the process is natural. So far, the process, I would say, is in the hands of God. That they want to take back control and do better than God.
yes.
They want to show God that they can do better. That is at least one motivation in certain scientists.
Mm.
I'll be quite clear about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one way in which this is quite clear is with maybe the process of IVF. And I was really fascinated to learn in your book that the man who developed IVF, Robert Edwards, was a prominent supporter of eugenic procedures. Now, you quote him as saying that initiating IVF, and this is the quote, was more than infertility. I wanted to find out exactly who was in charge, whether it was God himself or whether it was scientists in a laboratory. Edwards then concludes, it was us. Now, I don't think many churches are talking about IVF, let alone eugenics, but can you maybe elaborate on the connection between this IVF, this source of control and creating children in our own power, and the eugenics behind it as well?
So a lot of people who were behind IVF, even behind abortion, were eugenicists. So the
Mm.
legalization of abortion in the UK were eugenicists. I think a bit more work has still got. I think there's one or two articles now published on that, but I think it needs to be developed. Now, the problem with most forms of IVF, now there's different ways of doing IVF, but with most forms of IVF, um, it is associated again with selection. So in the UK, most of the time, there's about 10 to 12 embryos that are created in IVF, and then they are selected, and that's where the eugenic decision comes. So we say, oh, those embryos don't look quite healthy. They don't look quite good. So we'll not implant them. We'll just implant the best looking ones, basically, when the scientists look at the embryos in a microscope. So selection is already taking place. Now there's different forms of IVF, as I said, and sometimes, like in Germany, selection does not take place. So in Germany, in law, you can only create the number of embryos that can immediately then be implanted. So it's usually just one or two embryos that are created in Germany because they have to be, by law, implanted into the woman immediately. So there's no surplus embryos in Germany. Whereas in the UK, and we've just done some research on this, I'll probably send you the press release tomorrow. Actually, there's more than 500,000 embryos now frozen in the UK. But the problem with eugenics and IVS is when there's a number of embryos that have been created, and people are then selecting between which ones should basically survive and which ones should not.
Yeah, and that seems to be quite clear in terms of IVF when you've got the embryos there and you're trying to decide which ones you're going to implant. But you also talk about preconception eugenics, which I understand from your book to kind of mean the way that we select ourselves before conception takes place. So even deciding whether or not to have children. Can you talk a bit more about what you mean by preconception eugenics as well?
Yeah, there's different ways of doing it, but let's if I'm trying to take an example that is simple because it is a complex idea, but it's if a couple, the best way to do this is really through adoption. So
Okay.
adoption is also a way of selecting.
Hmm.
You can, and it was possible in the past, especially when the Soviet Union collapsed. It was possible for Westerners to go into some countries and go into orphanages and go into an orphanage as if they were going into a supermarket. So this is what was happening. These couples from the West were going into these places, looking at all the children and saying, don't quite like his smile. Oh, he's got a nasty face. Oh, he's too short. Yeah. Oh, this child is blonde with blue eyes. He's got a beautiful smile. We'll take him and adopt him. So this was what was taking place, and that is a form of eugenics because you are selecting the child based on you're selecting based on the biological characteristics of the child. Now, if the couple who wants to adopt is rich, if they are psychologically robust, if they will get an awful lot of support from their state, their country, for for having a child, and if they still select, that is preconception basically. Well, they won't conceive because they're just adopting. But if they still select, then that is a eugenic decision. However, if a couple knows that they are poor, that they are not psychologically robust, that they will not get very much support from the state, and then go into an orphanage and say, well, we can't cope with say a disabled child. We will only have to choose a child that is not disabled because we ourselves can't cope, then that would not be a eugenic decision because basically what they're saying is the problem is with themselves, so with the parents in a way. It's not about the child. They would be prepared. They know that all children are absolutely equal in value and worth, but
Hmm.
they themselves can't cope. But if they could cope and they still select, that is a eugenic decision. Now,
Okay.
there are new procedures now coming out, called heritable genome editing, and you'll hear an awful lot about this because as soon as the general election in the UK is over, the legislation has already been written, it's all ready, and it doesn't really matter who gets elected. The Department of Health is just waiting for 3 or 4 years in the House of Commons to get all this legislation through. So that's why it's going to start very, very soon after the general election. But all this has been drafted. And what the manner in which this is going to happen is they're going to try and the best way to do heritable genome editing, so making sure only the right children come into existence, only the right children are even conceived, is by making sure the right sperm that sperm is improved of the men and eggs are improved of the women. Now they can do that with stem cells. I won't go into the detail, but it's already theoretically possible to genetically improve the sperm of a man, genetically improve the egg of a woman. Then you have conception, and then you've made sure that the right child has come into existence. But basically, what you're saying is that you only want certain kinds of children to exist,
Mm.
and you do not want other kinds of children to exist, disabled children, for example. So you're doing a selection. Of course, you're doing a selection before conception, but you still, in your mind, you still had a procedure making sure that those persons come into existence and not these other kinds of disabled children who do not come into existence. So basically, what you're saying is that because you're making a choice between these two categories, that these children are better than those children. Now, that undermines the basic equality, the inherent equality of value and worth of all human beings. And
Mm.
that is, I think, one of the problems. I mean, so this is not about abortion. This is about undermining equality of all human beings, which
Yeah.
is just as important as life, basically. And so once you start to say these people should exist and those people should not exist, where do you stop? Do you go to a conference? Do you go to church and say to people, well, actually, you shouldn't have existed? I mean, then that's a
Hmm.
terrible thing to say. I mean, it's an awful thing to say. It's an awful thing to even think you should not have existed. Because one of the fundamentals of Christianity is not that we only have incredible value and worth, but we have equal incredible value and worth. Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of About Abortion. I hope you're appreciating these podcasts. And if you are, can I ask for your help in getting these vital messages to more people? We're delighted that we can get these to people free of charge. But that's not free for us to produce. It costs something like £300 to £400 a month to get these podcasts produced. And I wonder if you could help us, partner with us financially. Many of us will have an Amazon Prime subscription or some kind of streaming platform to the tune of £6, £7, £8 a month. I wonder if you consider, as it were, taking out a subscription with us. If you could donate, say, £8 a month, if we had about 40 people donating around £8 a month, just £8 a month, that would help us to continue to do these podcasts free of charge for anyone who wants to listen in. And this is the only podcast specifically about abortion in the UK. It's the greatest injustice, not only of our time, but in all history. Would you help us to bring these life-saving messages to more people? And don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe. Do send this in particular to your church leaders and anyone else you think might be interested. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll let you get back to the episode now.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. And I found a book in a charity shop. It was either by Mary Stopes or Margaret Sanger, which was talking similarly about preconception eugenics, but in terms of making sure only the right people were procreating and having children. But you're saying that you can actually change the genetics, even in what maybe wouldn't have been considered as the right people to reproduce, to make them into the right people. Is that correct in what I'm understanding?
So philosophically, it's not easy. And I've been trying to explain this for a couple, or 2 or 3 years now. But that's exactly what's happening. So parents want children of their own. whatever
Mm-hmm.
that means. Now, nobody knows why. They just do. And actually, my next book is why do parents want children of their own? But uh, but they still, so they want children of their own, but they want better children of their own in a way. So it will be possible for men to genetically improve their sperm,
Mm.
and women to genetically improve their eggs,
Wow.
so that they only have these better children in a way.
So, my next question is, because this isn't anything that really is being discussed in the Christian world. So, how do you think Christians are actually approaching this topic at the moment without having this input or people talking about it in the Christian community?
I don't think Christians have an input in this at all. I don't think they're approaching the topic at all either. I mean, it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I was so concerned. As I said, I mean, as soon as the election is over, so a couple of weeks in the UK, the ball is going to start rolling in this, and the churches are not ready at all. We haven't even
Mm.
started discussing this. And what is worse, and another thing that I noticed when I wrote this book, is how little, especially the Protestant and the Eastern Orthodox churches, have thought about this, even at the time, at the beginning of the 20th century, when it was quite respectable to be a pro-eugenicist.
Mm.
The churches just didn't, I don't know, they didn't think about it. So you had a whole lot of Protestant pastors in America who would refuse to marry people because they thought that one of the members of the couple had bad genes, and so on and so forth. It was,
Wow.
and these were Protestant pastors. The only people that were very much opposed to eugenics at the beginning of the 20th century was the Catholic Church. Uh, um, and
Yeah.
they, even in the time of the Nazis, actually, so the Bishop of Münster was preached against euthanasia and these kinds of selection procedures. Um, but the Protestant churches and the Eastern Orthodox churches didn't say very much. So that was another reason I wrote this book, is to try and get the churches thinking. But they're not thinking at the
Mm.
moment. They're really not.
Right.
And we are sleepwalking into this new legislation. And in this new legislation, there's going to be all sorts of topics. So the churches are going to be overwhelmed, and a lot of topics are not going to be addressed. I know, because I was very much involved in the 2008 amendment to the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act 1990, and there was so much there that the churches just couldn't cope.
It seems to me this is quite often the case, that maybe the Catholic Church are quite clear on these ethical issues, but a lot of Protestant churches just want to preach the gospel. They think that that's what they're here for, just preach the gospel, and they don't engage in these ethical discussions, which then doesn't equip their congregation in engaging in some of the things that are happening, or knowing how to respond biblically to these things, which I think is why your book is so important in helping people think through some of these issues that are happening from a Christian perspective, which they're not receiving from their pastors, who should be equipping them to be able to think through, not in the way that the world is coming into this, because the alternative is that they'll be discipled by the world. They'll be hearing some of these things, and if they're not hearing anything about it from their pastor, they'll just be thinking, well, this is a good thing, this is the way it should be. And we want to be clear, no, the Bible actually says every human is of equal value regardless.
Yeah. So I think you're completely right. I think that the pastors are not doing their jobs. I think, I don't think they should be preaching a lot about these kinds of topics, but at least they should be doing it once or twice a year. But they're not even
Mm-hmm.
doing that. I think a lot of pastors are afraid as well, because they're not scientists. A lot of them have become pastors. Not all of them, but a lot of them have become pastors because they were afraid of science, maybe. They're also afraid of the congregations, that their congregations will walk out, and if they start talking about IVF or other topics in church. I think pastors should be shepherds. I think they
Mm-hmm.
should be there to guide their congregations, but I don't think in these areas they are doing their job That is also for me extremely concerning. I think also the way Christians behave in these areas as a witness. I mean, one of the things that when Christianity was developing in the Roman times, so 2,000 years ago, was the way the Christians were witnessing was that they really, really valued all human life equally. So they would go outside the walls and look for the abandoned children. They were abandoned because nobody wanted them, or they were abandoned because they were disabled. They would go out and welcome these children because they would be considered exactly as anybody else. So Christianity, in a way, had a civilizing effect in society in the time of the Romans. But what's starting to happen in our society, which is becoming in a post-Christian society, is the post-Christian society is the same as the pre-Christian society, where life is becoming cheap, where selection is considered as acceptable, and where the churches are not witnessing in the way they behave towards life and towards the principle of equality of value and worth of all life. I think churches. I'm very concerned about the churches. I really am. Yeah. And that's why that was the only reason why I wrote this book, because I am so concerned about the churches. I know that very soon Christians are going to stand up and say, I've chosen my house, I've chosen my car, I've chosen my dog, I've even chosen my wife or my husband. So why can I not choose my children? And why would it be wrong for me to make sure my child is not disabled and suffering a terrible life? How can you be opposed to that? I know that that's going to come, and I know it's going to be very difficult for the church then to respond and say, hopefully the church will respond and say, well, every life is exactly the same in value and worth. Some lives are very short. Some lives only live for 15 minutes in suffering. But in God's eyes, and it's only God's eyes that matter, those lives are absolutely equal in value and in worth. And that's the only thing that really matters. It's not how we see life. It's not how society sees life. It's not even how the church sees life. It's how God sees life. And every life is incredibly precious because God created that life in his image to reflect the love that exists in the Trinity.
Wow, that's beautiful. Um, so powerful, isn't it, to be able to stand up against a society where, as you said, life is becoming cheap. And if I don't have, as you said, a house, a car, if I can't afford a holiday, then you don't deserve to exist, or you don't deserve life. It's really powerful to be able to have that witness. And I think we need to. Now, something I'm coming across a lot in conversations is words such as mercy, selflessness, particularly when it comes to, again, disabled or suffering children. Christians might hear it would be merciful not to bring this child into the world, or it would be selfless to end their life in the womb, or not to bring them into the world, rather than forcing them to live a life of suffering. Or to put the other way, it's selfish of you to force this child or to bring this child as a burden on society. Now, these kind of words might be difficult for Christians who might be thinking, well, I want to be merciful. I don't want to be selfish. I want to be selfless. And they might be confused about what then that would look like in terms of possibly disabled or children who might have some sort of suffering. Can you maybe help us think through how we as Christians can combat this kind of false sense of mercy, this false sense of selflessness, and what true selflessness would look like in these kind of situations?
I think so. It's interesting to talk to disabled people, and I work with some professors of disability at university who are disabled themselves, actually, and they are all adamant that they are happy to exist, even though they have disability, even though they have a life of difficulties, even though they have a life of sufferings. They see life still as fascinating. They see the value and worth of life as having priority, basically, or having more meaning than even a life of suffering. And we're all going to suffer in life when we get old, and so on and so forth. So I think, I mean, in one of your questions, you asked, is there ever a time when choosing not to have a seriously disabled child is the most loving or merciful thing to do? And I then asked myself, well, loving towards who? Loving
Mm.
towards the parents or loving towards the child? Because the child, even if it's disabled, but if the child knows it's really, really loved, will value life. And I think that's the main thing. I think we are in a society where quality of life is becoming more and more important. There's two things that really motivate our modern society. One is autonomy, so control. I want to do whatever I want. And the second thing is comfort and quality of life
Mm.
and reducing the suffering as much as possible. And that's really what's motivating bioethics, or many battles in bioethics at least. But the third thing that I would always insist on, which we forget, is the value and worth of life. And again, this equality of value and worth of life. And that has to have priority over quality of life.
Mm.
Because otherwise, if quality of life is the only thing that matters, everybody has a different quality of life. I mean, you probably, being a lot younger than me, will probably have many decades of life before you. I have a lot fewer decades of life before me. Does that mean we are unequal? Well, no. I mean, I am exactly the same value and worth as you, Beth, as anybody else. And we have to remember that as society. First of all, as I said, that value and worth of life is more important than suffering. If it is not, then we're in a very, very dangerous road.
Mm.
And value and worth is also more important than being able to do what I want. Yeah. I mean, I've known. I mean, I'm old enough now to have known couples whose children have died very, very early. These lives have only lasted a few hours of suffering. Do these lives have any less value or worth than anybody else's? Well, no. But if we ever said yes to that, and we are starting to say yes to that, even in the church, we are on very, very shaky moral ground, and we're going in a very dangerous direction.
Mm. Yeah, one thing that I think very interesting, as you point out, is that quality of life is taking precedence. And what I think is behind that is lots of people don't see the value in their own lives. And so seeing the value in other people's lives is incredibly tricky to convince people of when they don't see their own life as being valuable. And so all that is of value is the quality of life that they have. And again, when you have a post-Christian society, when there is no concept of suffering produces perseverance, produces character, and all these things leading to the glorious new heavens and the new earth where every tear will be wiped away. All we have is this life, then anything to improve the quality of this life is of the utmost importance, because you only have the one life. And once that's gone, it's gone.
Yeah. Well, as Christians, I think we have to remind ourselves that this life on earth is going to be a blip in our
Mm.
existence. And even these, so for example, when these children have died, I've just mentioned, who only lived for a few hours, I try to, I mean, the children of my friends, very close friends actually, but I try to think of them in the new creation, that I might go for long walks with them and talk about this life on earth. They might be interested, they might be curious, but I think of them as who they are, who they're going to become, who I am going to become when I die as well, and the kind of existence that we will have later on. So these children, even though they don't even have a name most of the time, um, their lives and my life is just going to be a blip
Mm.
in comparison to the millions of years of eternity. Yeah. And I think that's the way to think about it, not just think of things from this earthly perspective, but see things from an eternal perspective. And that helps us to put things back into perspective. And even if our lives are difficult here, and as I said, most people will eventually have a difficult life because they're getting old. It's still wonderful. And it's wonderful because God is with us. God will be with us through death, and God will be with us after death. That is how Christians should be thinking.
Yeah. And I think, as you keep saying, it's about value and equality of all life. But when I was reading your book, a lot that kept coming back to me was that in the West, our lives have become so comfortable that we've lost this concept of suffering, especially the suffering that is good, that we can rejoice in. So do you think maybe that there's something in that Christians might be more susceptible in the West to this eugenics thinking because we don't have a practical theology of suffering, which can underpin our thinking in this ethical issue?
Yes, the theology of I think there have been some books written on theology of suffering, but it's always very complicated, and sometimes suffering can be a mystery. Sometimes we don't know why people suffer. We don't understand it, and nobody can understand it. But what is remarkable is that, I became a Christian when I understood how much Jesus Christ suffered for me on the cross. It's interesting that I understood God's love through suffering. And so in a way, suffering. So I've written something totally different about how would people be if suffering did not exist? Yeah, and in a way, they would be happy biological robots. They would not be able to love. To be able to love, at least you need an ability to suffer. It's very interesting, actually. And and that's certainly certainly the case with God. Yeah. So God, through Jesus Christ, can suffer, and that's how I knew how much He loved me, and that's why I became a Christian. Um, and God is certainly not a biological happy robot. Actually, if I had children who are happy biological robots, I could not love them. I don't think they could love me either, because they would be happy all the time. Yeah, so they would be really, really boring. Yeah, so it's only because people have actually the ability. I don't want people to suffer, but it's only because people have the ability to suffer that I can understand that they can love me, and I can love them, which is really fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
That's all I can say about suffering. I'm not a theologian, and I do know there's quite a few books written about suffering in Christianity. And some suffering is complex, and suffering can sometimes we sometimes we just do not understand suffering.
yeah, and I
But
think
it's also necessary for love to exist.
yes. And I think you're quite right pointing out, again, it comes back to the value and equal worth of every human being. And I think if in the churches we were hearing about this applied to all spheres of human experience as well, not just preconception and pregnancy and children, but if we were hearing this being underlined, I think that would enable us to experience suffering in a different lens, coming from that foundation. I think the value and dignity of each and every person is really a foundational doctrine that is being neglected, and it has so many widespread implications for the church that if we do continue to neglect it, it's going to impact so many different aspects of life and experience, including suffering, which is often one of the situations and the circumstances that is used to undermine the value of life, isn't it?
Exactly, and sometimes when you go to church, and I've been when I go to church, and the fact that God died on the cross, Jesus Christ died on the cross for us, is repeated again and again and again. And I think, I think that's really important. But sometimes what we forget is there's something just as wonderful that happened as the cross, and that's the creation of human beings. And actually, the creation of human beings was also a creation out of the love of the Trinity. And it's amazing. Creation is also through grace. So each one of us exists because we were created by God. And it's a creation, as I said, through incredible loving grace. And the recreation through the cross is exactly the same. It's through love and grace. Yeah. So the creation and the recreation are linked and are just as wonderful. But with the creation, it gives us the basis of civilized society, at least in the West. The West may deny it, but the reason why we believe in equality is because we believe that we all created in image by the same God with the same image in a way. There is no other reason for equality. I mean, I'm a scientist, and from a scientific perspective, we're just all piles of cells made up of 70% water. There is no value and worth in any of us. And we're certainly not equal, because some people are a lot bigger and maybe have a lot more human cells than I do. Yeah. But that certainly doesn't mean that we are unequal. So the fact that we believe in equality comes from a Christian heritage. I would even say, I grew up in France, and there's this motto in France: liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. That was the motto of the revolution in France. But if you ask most French people, why are we equal? I don't think they'll be able to answer. But the answer is we are equal because of a pre-Christian heritage, before the French Revolution. That's why we are equal. We believe that all human beings are equal. And it is a belief. It's not a scientific proof of equality. It's a belief in equality.
Yeah, as in America, it's these inalienable rights, these things that have intrinsic to who we are, that have been given to us by an outside authority, not by ourselves, isn't it? I would be really interested to ask you, as you researched and wrote this book, what was the most surprising thing that you found about eugenics?
I think the most surprising thing I found about eugenics is how little the Christians have thought about it, and how little the Christians had even written about it. And that, especially as I said, in the Protestant and the Eastern Orthodox churches, and I was extremely concerned about this. So that was the most surprising thing.
So are there other books that you can point people to in terms of the Christian writing on this, or is it so limited that you can't even recommend any?
I cannot recommend any. I can remember
Okay.
there's a few articles, and I've got my book here in front of me, and there's a few books actually, but they're written from a secular perspective of
Right.
about eugenics. There's this book, In the Name of Eugenics, by DJ Calvis, and it looks at the history of eugenics. It's quite detailed. It's an academic book, but Christian books about eugenics, at least from an Orthodox perspective, there are none apart from the one I wrote. I'm really sorry
Okay.
to say that. There are some liberal ones who are in favor of eugenics, but and
Right.
they are not really developed. And I don't believe they have thought about all the different issues either. But yeah, that's why I wrote the book, because I really believe that there's nothing out there, and at least now
Yeah.
there is something. I mean, it's not perfect, but no book is perfect. There's always things develop, science develops, and so on. But at least there's something there, and I hopefully when the new legislation comes out in the UK in a few weeks or a few months' time, people will at least have something to base their thinking on from at least a Christian perspective. I am very concerned that the churches are not going to do their work with this new legislation coming out. I mean, it's not even talked about at the moment. Yeah. And it is all going to go very fast, and all the topic. So the Department of Health in London has been preparing this legislation for years. So it's extremely detailed, it's extensive, and the churches are not going to be able to react in 3 months, because that's how long you usually get a public consultation on all the different topics into any depth. And so that's why I'm extremely concerned about what's going to happen. And I believe that the UK is going to legalize what we call heritable genome editing. So basically, being able to make sure that even before conception, your children are going to be the right kind of children. And everybody's going to say, well, why not? This is going to be fantastic. It's going to undermine equality, that's for sure.
And what was the most challenging part as well? Is it, again, were you just challenged by how little the church is engaging with this, or were you challenged by some of the history that you uncovered of eugenics?
I'm challenged by how little the churches are interested. Churches
Yeah.
are not interested in this. They're not. I'm
Yeah.
sorry to say they're not. They're not. As you say, they want to preach a gospel that is always positive, but they don't. I don't think so. One of the things that helped me when I was a young Christian, and this was hammered into me in Scotland by an old Church of Scotland minister. He says, when you are a Christian, you take up your cross and you follow Christ. And that's what matters. It's not having a nice life. It's not having a comfortable life. Now, some Christians may have a nice, comfortable lives, and that's what God wants them to have, and fair enough. But that's not what matters. What really matters is following Christ, no matter whether the road is easy or the road is difficult. What matters is following Christ, because that's why we were created. That's why we exist, to have fellowship with Christ in the difficult times and in the easy times, but also to be witnesses of his love. And his love, the love of God that should be flowing through us, is again a love that should be equal to everyone. We shouldn't just love certain kinds of people, people our age or people in our own socio-economic bracket. We should be loving all the people that God calls us to love, and that's everyone that he puts on our road anyway. We can't love the whole world because there's billions of people, but we can love the people that God puts on our road, a bit like the Good Samaritan. And that's why we exist, to share his love, which is an equal love to everyone. And I'm concerned that if we just concentrate on a sort of personal assistant God, we are losing all that. We have to be witnesses of his love, witnesses of the value and worth of all life, witnesses of the equality of value and worth of all life. That is why the church fights racism. That's why the church fights ableism. That's why the church fights even what I call techism, where only young people know how all the technology works and the old people are just forgotten about. Yeah, and the church should be an inclusive place which is fighting all these discriminations. So that's for me. That's really, really important. That's how the church is a witness. But we should certainly be talking about a lot of this in the church. Yeah. But I always remember a story, and I'll try not to say too many details about it. So that anyway, it was in Scotland, and so some years ago, I was contacted by some elders in the church, and these elders had a real problem because one of their members, who's a single woman, had just become pregnant, and they didn't know what to do. So they phoned me up. And what had happened is that this woman had gone to a sperm bank and got some sperm in Scotland and then inseminated herself. And she didn't believe that was wrong, because in the Bible it doesn't say thou shalt not go to a sperm bank and inseminate yourself. And in church, nobody ever talked about this topic. So she went to a sperm bank and got inseminated because she thought that was the right thing to do. Now, it wasn't her fault. It was the church's fault. And I tried to tell the elders, well, if you never talk about it, well, what do you expect from your members?
Yes. I know we haven't really spoken much about abortion, but I think the thinking behind eugenics, and how we're again taking autonomy, control for ourselves, and trying to play God in this situation. A lot of the thinking behind abortions is quite similar, about taking the control for ourselves. And so I think it's really good to get back to that root and also see the other implications that can come from that thinking. And it's so interesting, as you spoke earlier about the Nazis and how their eugenics programs kind of put a halt to eugenics in Europe for quite a while. Again, the church wasn't really speaking out. You had very small groups of Christians who were standing up against the tide, but the majority of the church was silent. And in doing so, it allowed that project to continue. It allowed Hitler to continue the evils that he was perpetrating. Now, that put a halt to the trajectory of eugenics for a while. Jonathan Friedland, in an article for The Guardian, wrote, "Eventually, in the shadow of Auschwitz, the British left gave up its flirtation with eugenics because they had seen where it led. However, as you're so clearly pointing out, that's not entirely true, is it? We're seeing that actually eugenics is very much alive and well. Maybe we don't call it eugenics because that's now an ugly word with those associations, but we are still having eugenics thinking behind these practices, even though we're not labeling them as eugenics. Now, if the church, again, fails to speak out like it did that first time, where do you see the trajectory of this heading, particularly here in the UK?
So you're right. We're not going to call it eugenics. In this piece of legislation that's going to come up very soon, they'll call it something, I don't know, it's therapeutic selection. It'll sound good anyway, but it'll all just be spin. It'll just be eugenics. But I think that if we do accept this, we will be going in the same direction as the Nazis. It's inevitable. It'll probably take us longer to get there. But as soon as a society starts to believe that there are lives unworthy of life, as soon as a society starts to no longer believe in the equality of all value and worth of life, and this we are seeing also in assisted suicide, because the whole point of suicide, again, is autonomy, wanted control, and secondly, they want a nice death. So euthanasia this time. So eu means good in Greek and thanatos means death. So, but as soon as we start to give up on this concept of the value and worth of life, which the Nazis did, but they certainly did not believe in equality, we will eventually go in the same direction as them. It might take us longer, but it will go in the same direction, and we'll end up in the same place, and that's barbarity. It'll be a hell. It'll be hell. And the people don't realize that. They don't realize what they've given up. They've gone over. They'll walk over the bright red line of believing that there are certain lives unworthy of life. And when you go over that line, there's no coming back, and there's no stopping. You'll end up in the same place as the Nazis. And another thing, and I like to add this, when I talk about this at conferences and so on, everybody says, "Oh, how dare you compare me to Nazi politics or philosophies?" But we were not. I mean, I lived in Germany for a number of years, and in Scotland, the Scottish people are not better than the Germans in the time of the National Socialists. The Germans are exactly the same as the Scots right now. And to believe that we are inherently better than them really reflects a lack of humility and a lack of reality. In Britain, we can go in exactly the same way as the Nazis and end up in exactly the same place as the Nazis. And if we believe that we are better than the Germans in the beginning of the 20th century, as I said, it really reflects a lack of reality and a lack of humility.
Yeah, there's that well-known saying, isn't there, that those who forget history are bound to repeat it. And so if we are proud enough to think that because of we're 100 years on, there's this myth of progress that just because we're born later in history, therefore we are automatically more advanced and more morally and ethically superior to those in the past, as well as the blindness of just thinking, well, if I lived in that time, I'd never have allowed that to happen, whilst being blinded to the moral evils of our own day. It's a dangerous place, and I think that your book is a very almost prophetic warning to the church of what is going to happen if we don't stand up and say something. Now, this book is, again, primarily written for Christians, and as a warning, it's excellent to wake us up to the issue at hand. But what would you say, going forward, practically, Christians need to do in order to stop this? It's one thing to be aware of what's going on, but another thing to then take action to try and see this come to an end. So what would you recommend Christians who get this book, read this book, they become aware of what's happening in society? What's the next step for them to do?
Well, I mean, one of the things I quite like Christians should do is talk about it a lot more amongst their friends. So, I talk about bioethics when we have our Christmas meal, because everybody's quite interested. On some of these topics. It gives a good topics for conversation. But I think we've got to inform our society somehow. I mean, we do the best we can here up in Scotland. I mean, some years ago, actually, we had a Eugenics film festival, and so where we showed documentaries, which were the most difficult actually, because documentaries that shows what really happened in the past, and these were real films from Nazi Germany. And after the films, everybody was rushing to the bar to get a whiskey because they were so depressed. But we also showed science fiction about what are the science fiction is really useful to show the risks and advantages, and then to show where it is possible to go. Unfortunately, so I think we should be talking about this a lot more at conferences, in different settings, Christmas meals, or wherever. But I think pastors. I mean, I teach in a seminary, so upstairs there's a seminary here that's part of the University of Glasgow, actually, and we have a whole class on eugenics. And after all these classes, I tell them, go and preach about this. Don't just leave it to other people, but preach about it. Maybe not very often, maybe not even in the morning service. So in the past in Scotland, we usually had two services, one in the morning, one evening. One in the evening, usually the kids were not there, and there was more theology in a way. But maybe the evening service or some other setting. But you've got to talk about this in the church. You can't just sweep it under the carpet because you're afraid of the congregation, or you're afraid of the work it might entail by reading the book or doing other research for your sermons. If you need some help for your sermon, just phone me. I tell my students to do that if they're stuck, but they should not just sweep it under the carpet, because otherwise we'll be going in a very dangerous direction.
One of my friends refers to it as the spiral of silence, that the longer you have the silence, the further down the spiral you progress, and the harder it is to break that silence as well. So your recommendation is just break the silence, talk about it wherever you are, whether it's in a cafe with your Christian friends, around the dinner table, in the church, wherever you are. Just start talking about it and normalize that conversation as well, so that it's not a taboo subject, but it's something that people can bring. Because I think a lot of the time, especially as we talk a lot about abortion, the reality is that when it's not discussed in church, people feel ashamed of bringing it to church. They feel they can't talk about it. And so even if people are struggling with some of these issues, or they're trying to think through these things for themselves, the less that they hear about it in a church, the less they think they can talk about it in church, which is just furthering that spiral of silence. So
I
do
think
you
you're
have
right.
any?
I think the churches should be lighthouses to society. In certain topics, they're black holes to society. And I think there should not be any taboos. I mean, 40 years ago, I went to this church. I told you that the old minister in the Church of Scotland, and it was horrifying to realize that he would preach on topics that nobody would ever dream of even talking about. But he would preach on it. And this was 40 years ago. Where Victorian values were extremely strong in Scotland, that he would not miss a topic, and people knew where to stand. This minister also wrote quite a lot in the letters to the editor in the newspapers, so that's another way of doing it. I mean, if you do write a balanced letter to the newspapers, they usually get published, as long as you're not being nasty to somebody or blowing your top. If it's reasonable, if it's done with wisdom and compassion, these letters usually get published in the newspapers. So that's another way of maybe sharing the concerns.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. MacKellar, for coming on this interview. If people want to find out more, obviously they can buy your book, Christianity and the New Eugenics. I do encourage people to do that and read it. It is fantastic. Just a really good resource to have at hand as well. But where else can they find you, read more about what you're thinking through, researching, writing? Where can people find you?
They can't. Well, yeah, they can find me. Well, I'm trying to think of an organization I'm associated to. If you write to the Christian Institute, and some of you probably know about the Christian Institute, they always have my contact details and they know what I'm working on more or less. I have worked for the Christian Institute, published some booklets for them on some topics in the past. I work with them not closely, but I usually go down to Newcastle and give them conferences to their staff on these kinds of topics, actually, so that the Christian Institute, but also their staff, can ask questions about why this is important and so on, not just on eugenics, but on other topics that we're working on too. So we're working on posthumans at the moment. So posthumans and transhumans are people who are not quite human anymore. They're half animal or half robot. So that's the kind of work we're doing. Yeah.
Very
Probably
interesting.
best. Probably best to work with the Christian Institute. They know where I am and what I'm doing, and CARE also knows what I'm doing. So Christian Action Research and Education. So they have 2 or 3 members of staff in Scotland, and these 2 or 3 members, we work very closely together with CARE. Yeah.
Brilliant. And have you written anything else that you would recommend people go and find and buy and read as well?
On Christian bioethics. So there's this
Yes.
book, actually, if I can show it to you. So it's called The Image of God, Personhood, and the Embryo. So that's been written some years ago. Again, it's trying to explain why. It's actually a result of a big, long discussion at the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. I was part of Church of Society at the time, the Council of Church of Society of the Church of Scotland, and there was a big debate on the value and worth of embryos and whether embryos were created in the image of God. I believe they are, and therefore we had this long debate, and this book is a sort of result of this long debate, but me trying to explain, with the help of others actually, why the embryo is created in the image of God and is just as wonderful as you and me. So we go back and look at the history of the church relating to the embryo. Not much, actually, because they didn't have microscopes in those days and they didn't really understand what was going on. But the church did talk a lot about abortion, and it also talked about when did souls go into human bodies, which is not something. Well, anyway, the book doesn't really believe that souls enter human bodies. The book really eventually comes to the conclusion that bodies and souls are created at the same time. That means at the embryonic level. It also develops the whole idea that Jesus Christ was an embryo, which is so we should actually be celebrating the incarnation 9 months before Christmas, which the Eastern Orthodox Church does actually a lot more than the Protestant and Catholic churches. So on that they got it right, that we should be celebrating the incarnation when Jesus Christ became an embryo. But the fact that Jesus Christ became an embryo, the third person of the Trinity was an embryo, shows how important embryos are. And so that's another argument. There's lots of different arguments in this book to try and explain from a theological perspective, with lots of references, the history, but also the present theology of why embryos are created in the image of God. Even though they don't have any heads, they don't have any hearts, they don't have any brains, and they don't have any face, but they are whole, and they do reflect, they are alive, and they are created by God. Well, their life, the embryo is alive, and that life is created by God, and that's what matters. And it doesn't really matter if the embryo is very, very small. I mean, from God's perspective, our whole galaxy is very, very, very small. So again, it's from God's perspective that matters. It's not our perspective that matters.
Yeah. Well, thank you again so much for coming on this interview. Maybe I'll have to bring you back on to talk more about that book, God.
If you like, I'd be happy to do so. Yeah.
That would be really interesting. I'll have to get that myself and give it a read. So thank you for this interview. For all of our listeners, don't forget, please buy Dr. MacKellar's book, Christianity and the New Eugenics, and give it a read and begin to talk about these things in your churches, with your friends, with your family, and break that spiral of silence around this issue that is leading to a very dark direction in this country. Thank you, and join us again next week for another episode.